Hello, I am Tom Banks. I last year competed in my first ultra event, and after the event decided to do a very frank, open and honest review of how the race went. A very few select people did actually watch the video and kindly told me they found it beneficial. That was for the Pennine Barrier 50 mile ultra hosted by the amazing GB Ultras, which I am incredibly fortunate and in a very privileged position to be an ambassador for. So this year I have competed and ran in 2 of their ultra events, and I wanted to do a similar sort of thing. And the one I am going to be talking about today is the 100-kilometre race that I competed in across the Brecon Beacons. And my days, it was a hell of a day out. But yeah, as with the last video, it's just going to be me talking, unfortunately. So if that doesn't interest you and you want to see all the amazing reels, in-race highlights and other content that is available online, switch it off, because this probably isn't the video for you. If you do want to hear a very open and honest and frank assessment of how the race was, obviously just for myself, and you might be able to draw something from it, then keep on listening. So, without further ado, the race I took part in, I should say, was in July the 22nd, which in the height of British summertime, you would hope for a clear day. But as mentioned, it was in the Brecon Beacons and in Wales. The last year's event was incredibly wet with some monumental weather on offer. And this year didn't fail to live up to expectations on that front. And throughout the next however long I'm going to ramble on for, you will get hopefully a bit of a picture of how challenging the weather conditions were. So much so that the route did have to be changed, as with a lot of the mountain races that GB Ultras, I should say, offer. They do have alternative routes available if the higher mountains are deemed to be unsafe. And it does take quite a lot ultimately to trigger that warning, but safety is paramount, and as I say, they are an amazing company. But yes, we will come to that. So the 100k route, the start point is at 11 a.m. And it starts just outside Talibont. The 100 mile race, which starts 40 miles further down the road, starts at 6 a.m. But as I say, 100k is 11 a.m. I was very fortunate to have my lovely fiancée Christy with me, supporting and crewing me. And throughout the race, I must say that did make a monumental difference. I was prepared for the weather. I did eagerly watch all of the forecasts leading up to the event and was under no illusion that it was going to be immensely wet, very windy and quite challenging conditions. So as well as all the mandatory kit, I did prepare at least one set of socks for each checkpoint I was at, as well as a backup jacket, a new layer of clothing, certainly for the top half at every checkpoint. Although kit that I wear, the top half is a Gore-Tex coat. Ultimately, you want which does repel and keep out a lot of the water, just with the nature of how wet it was and how ferocious the winds were at times. It's just impossible to keep the wet out. So that's something that I will mention throughout. But anyway, we haven't even started the race yet, and I've rambled on for quite a length of time. So we got going at 11. As I say, quite a wet start. It starts from a village hall and on a road section for a short amount of time. Obviously very runnable. The biggest lesson I wanted to take from my last event, as with probably a lot of runners in their first ultra, we all set off a little bit too hot. As much as we want to dial down that pace at the beginning, it's very, very difficult to dial the pace down. So that was my biggest mission, shall we say, my biggest goal for the start of the race, was to really not push off and go too hard. I knew the first section, which was roughly about 6 miles to checkpoint 2, was steadily uphill, but largely runnable in most places. But my main goal for this was ultimately to fast hike anything that was a gradient uphill. As frustrating as that would be at times, as I know that a number of people would possibly move past me and be pushing at a faster speed. But yeah, so the game plan worked, to be honest. The first 6 miles, very wet and very windy, ultimately into a headwind because we had a westerly the whole day. But yeah, lovely terrain, some spikier bits at times in terms of the climb, but there is a very long drag up to checkpoint 1, which is a gravel track ultimately, and that probably 1 to 2%. Very easy to get carried away there and move too quickly. But I was fairly pleased with myself as I got into checkpoint 1, which was amazingly crude as always. Filled up both bottles at that point, and from there on, you are ultimately moving uphill at certainly a higher percentage in terms of the incline, shall we say. So from that point on, we're heading up towards Pen y Fan in the distance. So yeah, it's a decent climb out of the first checkpoint. Point to note, in my first ultra, I didn't use poles. Bit of a hot topic, I know, cheat sticks. Should you use them, should you not? I didn't in my first ultra. I left it a little bit too late and then decided I didn't have enough time, if I was going to use them anyway, to train with them prior to the event. So opted to go without. And then this event certainly gave myself a lot more time to think about it. And I invested in some poles, and on all of the climbs, any gradient that was above 2 or 3%, the poles came out. Obviously put away when scrambling and using my arms, but they were hugely beneficial, and from my perspective, I certainly recommended them. So yeah, poles came out at this point, and we started climbing. And that section of the race, once you get above that 700-800 metre mark, was very exposed, gusting up to 50, maybe even 60 mile an hour. I was moving fairly slowly at times just to compensate for the weather. I did see a good few people actually physically get blown off their feet because of how extreme the conditions were. So yeah, immensely challenging. But the weather, from my perspective, if you can get your mindset and in a position, shall we get your mindset in a position where you are accepting of the weather, you know that it's not going to change too much, then it shouldn't, it hopefully won't affect your race too much. And that's the zone that I managed to get myself in, and became well acquainted with the conditions and accepted that Mother Nature was going to make it a bit of a challenge, shall we say. So yeah, that section, 7-ish miles up Pen y Fan and then back down again, was immensely challenging in terms of the weather. Very, very windy, very wet. But I was fairly pleased with my pacing. I pushed fairly hard on the descent to try and warm myself back up again. And as I came back down into checkpoint 2, I got a lovely surprise. Wasn't expecting it at all, but my brother had decided to come up and surprise me, and he was with Christy at the checkpoint. So that was phenomenal. Great confidence boost to see him. He'd also brought an additional pair of waterproof gloves for me, which I used from that point onwards, and they made an immense difference. I was starting to get blisters on the hands from gripping the poles ultimately, and because it was so wet, these gloves did make a big difference. So having that additional kit, seeing him there, was phenomenal. So that was great. In and out of the checkpoint fairly quickly. Did change socks though, as I alluded to at the beginning of the programme, and changed layers as well. Stayed in the same coat at this point. So the next section out of checkpoint 2 is fairly undulating again, kind of in the heart of the Beacon National Park. Very boggy, very wet, very exposed. But yeah, I'd recce'd this section, so I was well familiar with it, and pleased with how I paced myself ultimately. The race had very much split out at this point. Visibility wasn't amazing, but you could make out runners in the distance, which certainly helped me in terms of pacing. I just tried to keep them within a reasonable distance at this point and work my way through to checkpoint 3. As I say, I was familiar with a lot of the terrain there, which very much helped. And the GB Ultras as a brand and as a company do offer recce runs of all the races, and I'd very much recommend you do that. It does make a big difference on race day if you know where you're going. Coming into checkpoint 3, which is roughly around 20 miles, I was feeling pretty good, although very wet and weathered at this point. One blessing was that obviously it wasn't hot, so definitely wasn't overheating. There wasn't a need for too many electrolytes, that side of things. So that was good, and I was seeing the positive in that. The legs were feeling good at this point, but as we were leaving the checkpoint, we were made aware that the route had been changed. So that because of the extreme weather, the high pass that we were due to move on to had been changed to a lower route. Now, the lower route itself, there is a GPX file which is shared. I realised, huge schoolboy error at this point, that I hadn't actually loaded this onto my watch. Could navigate through my phone, but would have been a bit of a pain. But immensely grateful at that point to come across a couple of other runners. Dave Rogers, who I ended up finishing the race with, and stayed with throughout the whole duration from this point, and a lovely young lad called Ross Harvey, I believe, who fortunately had the lower route on his watch. We came out of that checkpoint, agreed to work together as a 3, and it's great to have companionship in any race. And certainly in something as extreme as this, with the weather very much stacked against us and plenty of miles to come. So, yeah, good bit of camaraderie at this point, out of that checkpoint, hitting the foot of where the climb would have gone up. If the route hadn't been changed, it was obvious to see why that decision was made, and the wind was really howling at this point. We followed the lower route. At this point, because of the sheer volume of water that had been put down, the rivers really were, flowing, shall we say, bursting the banks, an extreme amount of water coming through the valleys, and there was a river crossing at one point. Incredibly grateful to be in a group of 3 crossing this river. Bearing in mind I'm 6'4", so pretty tall. Going through the river, it was pretty much up to my waist and moving very quickly. So we certainly paid a lot of care and attention when crossing, and had each other's backs. So yeah, that was good. Coming out of the river though, my right quadricep, I don't know whether it was just the shock of the water or I pushed off too hard, but I did feel quite a bit of pain running through the quad. As I say, we're working as a 3 at this point, and frustratingly, I was really struggling with the pace. The pain was fairly severe. I'm quite stubborn, and I will carry on moving unless I am given a significant reason as to stop. I've never DNF'd a race, fortunately, and it never really plays too much on my mind. I am very much, I'll get to the finish at all costs. But as I say, the pain really was starting to nag away. The weather, because of the nature of it and how wet and windy it was, Both Dave and Ross had moved a good 100 metres ahead of me. Because it was that wet and windy, you couldn't really get a conversation going. So I think they were fairly oblivious to the fact that my pace had dropped off. But in my mind, I was almost tapping out at the next checkpoint. I was going to try and limp my way there. I genuinely thought I'd pulled or done something fairly severe to the quad at this point. But over the next mile or so, I had a severe word with myself, and basically just told myself to crack on and try and catch the two up, which fortunately I did. I dug in and basically tried to part the pain as much as I could. I managed to catch them up. We had a little bit of a chat. They realised obviously I had dropped off. I made it clear that I was struggling a little bit. And yeah, the conversation was just about trying to push it to the back of my mind and hope that ultimately it would disappear. So yeah, we pushed on together with Ross mainly navigating. He knew the area incredibly well, ran around that area quite a lot. So we were thankful for his knowledge ultimately. As I say, I'd recce'd part of the route, but not this particular section. But yeah, we came to a point where the road was, and we knew that we weren't a million miles away from the checkpoint, which was one of the main halls and drop point. This was at a point where a lot of people in the race were ultimately dropping out just because the conditions were that bad and they'd been that battered. But we came in as a three in relatively high spirits. We'd had a bit of a conversation about staying together. I got some warm food down me, changed all my clothes, and with night coming at this point, 39 miles in, I believe we were, decided to put a slightly bigger jacket on just to keep me warm throughout the night. Got the head torch out, and Dave and myself were ready to go. Ross was still sorting a few bits. He instructed us to move out as a two. So we did. This section, as I say, is a bit of an out and back. All pretty runnable because it's tarmac road. So we pushed on. And this next section of the race as night falls is always fairly tricky to navigate, certainly when the weather's against you and you're in cloud cover, fog sets in. It was still incredibly wet, and we knew that this terrain was some of the boggiest sections of the course ultimately, and the path hard to find in the daytime, let alone the night. So we struggled on. To be honest, it was a very tough section. From that section, the last checkpoint I should mention is 39 miles in. This section takes you up to 48 miles, so it is 9 miles in length, and it is, without being too hard on the section, an absolute brute. Certainly depending on what time of the day you hit it. If like us as night falls you hit it, it's a beast. Very boggy, very wet, and the trail is quite hard to identify and pick up, but immensely grateful for the company. We worked together really well, kept ourselves in fairly high spirits. We were pretty cold and wet by this point, and as I say, the sun had set, night had set in, and we slogged away for 9 miles and fortunately got to the next checkpoint, which was at 48 miles. Fairly exposed and relatively high up this checkpoint. The marshals there, again, as I should mention, with all the checkpoints, were amazing. We both came in there very, very cold, very wet. I wouldn't necessarily go to say borderline hypothermic, but I was shivering. It's the first time I physically got in the van to warm up. Took my jacket off. Christy put a blanket round me, a foil blanket, to try and warm me up. Fortunately, I got offered a warm tea. I took 4 sugars with it, which is a bit of a rarity, but needs must. And that tea was a bit of a game changer. Definitely breathed a bit of life in me. Checked with Dave's partner, who was crewing. She came across and checked. I was okay ultimately, and then we were ready to go. And this is 48 miles into the race. So yeah, probably slightly over because of the route change. The last section is a slog. Ultimately, the best part of 14, 15 miles through to the finish line. This is the last big checkpoint. So we knew it was going to be a long slog to home, but we'd got this far, and there was no way that we were dropping out. So we left the checkpoint in a lot higher spirits than we entered it. We were refreshed from the warm drink, new layer of clothes on the top, and I'd put a new pair of socks on, obviously, and I'd changed my shoes as well to a drier shoe, just to give my feet a bit of a treat. But by this point they were fairly mashed and mushed up anyway. But changing the socks, I will stress again, every checkpoint, giving them a clean, did make a huge difference. I left the race with very little issues with my feet, which, considering for the duration of the time I was out there, the 18 odd hours, was a bit of a minor miracle, because trench foot could have well and truly set in. But yeah, the last bit of the race is still very much edged in my mind. By this point we've been battered severely by the weather the whole way round, so it was just going to be a case of getting it done. And the tempo had slowed right down. We were fast hiking large parts of the race, but yeah, we were pushing on, and beautiful terrain, I must say. It is a huge shame that we didn't see a huge amount of it, but yeah, the countryside is fantastic. And actually, the weather as the sun came up, the weather did improve a little bit, and it was the best part of the race ultimately. If anyone has raced a duration of time that's led them through a sunset and gets a second wind or a boost from a sunrise, fair play to you. I didn't really feel that myself. It was just a case of, the sun's coming up, we've still got 7 miles to go, or whatever it was. So yeah, it didn't really happen. It might happen in future races, but I think we were just that wet and tired. There certainly wasn't a boost to me, so that's maybe something to look forward to in the future. But I thought I'd share that insight from my perspective anyway on the sunrise. But yeah, we slogged away. We looked at the watches and saw 100k tick by, and when you know you're racing for 100k, you kind of want in the finish line to get closer. But because of the route changes and everything else, we edged our way closer and closer. And funnily enough, there's a village called Bethlehem at the end of towards the end of the route, and my God, yeah, literally, my God, we were ready. But I was hoping that was the final village, but immensely disappointed to learn that we still had another 3 or 4k to go. But we grinded it out and we got it done. So yeah, fabulous race against Mother Nature in terms of the conditions. But yeah, what can I say? You have to dig in deep. You have to prepare yourself for the weather mentally, and yeah, thoroughly recommend it. Thanks ever so much for watching. I'll pop up another review of the other ultra I've done, and hopefully you've enjoyed it. If you have, give it a like. Thanks very much.